My name is Clara Elizabeth Vance, and I am writing these words from the quiet corner of my 92nd year. I was born in the winter of 1844 in a small settlement nestled in the valley of the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. The world I entered was one of candlelight and wood smoke, where the rhythm of our lives was dictated by the rising sun and the turning of the seasons. My father was a man of the earth, a stonemason who carved his living out of the very bones of the hills, while my mother kept a home that was as orderly and disciplined as a church hymnal. I remember the smell of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and the sound of the wind howling through the gaps in the timber walls during those long mountain winters. We were people of few words and hard work, believing that a silent tongue and a busy hand were the marks of a righteous soul. I grew up believing that every action was recorded by the heavens, and that even a small transgression could cast a shadow over a family for generations. My mother taught me to mend fabric until the stitches were invisible, and to sweep a floor until not a single grain of dust remained. She often said that a woman's reputation was like a pane of glass. Once cracked, it could never be made whole again. I carried that lesson with me like a heavy stone in my pocket, never imagining how deeply it would eventually bury me. Life in the valley was simple, but it was not soft. We knew the taste of hunger when the frost came early, and the weight of grief when the fever took the children from the neighboring farms. But through it all I remained the dutiful daughter, the one who never complained, and who found comfort in the predictable lines of my daily chores. It was a life of quiet expectations until the summer I turned 17, when the air began to thick with the talk of war, and the peace of our valley was shattered forever. But the war was not the source of the sin I have carried. The darkness I speak of was born in a moment of desperate silence, a choice I made when the world was falling apart, and I believed I was saving what little we had left. For 80 years I have watched the sun rise and set over these mountains, carrying a secret that has tasted like ash in my mouth every single day. I have been called a saint by my neighbors and a pillar of the community by my children, but they do not know the truth of what lies beneath the floorboards of my memory. Now, as the light begins to fade for the final time, I find that I can no longer bear the weight of it alone. I must tell the story of that summer and the shadow that followed me from the creek to the grave. The year 1861 brought a fever to the valley that had nothing to do with the spirits of the mountains, and everything to do with the hearts of men. I was 17 then, and my world was defined by the golden light of late summer and the quiet presence of Silas Thorne. Silas was the son of a neighboring farmer, a boy who had grown up just 3 miles down the road, but who suddenly seemed like the only person I had ever truly seen. We spent our Sundays walking by the creek where the water ran cool over the smooth gray stones, and we spoke in the hushed tones of those who are beginning to realize that the world is much larger and more dangerous than their parents had ever admitted. Silas had hands that were calloused from the plow, but he handled the wildflowers he picked for me with a gentleness that made my heart ache. We made promises under the shade of the ancient oaks, promises that were whispered with the certainty of youth, as if the future were a map we could draw ourselves. He spoke of building a cabin on the ridge, and I spoke of the garden I would plant, and for a few short months the looming shadow of the conflict in the east felt like nothing more than a distant storm that would surely pass us by. But the storm did not pass. It swept through the valley like a scythe, and Silas, along with every other able-bodied young man, was called to answer a cause that few of us truly understood. The day he left, the air was heavy and still, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. I watched him walk down the dirt road until he was nothing more than a speck of gray against the green of the trees, and I felt a hollow space open up inside me that has never truly closed. With the men gone, the burden of the farms fell to the women and the elderly. My days became a blur of relentless labor as I tried to help my father maintain the homestead, while my mother's health began to flicker like a candle in a draught. It was during those long, lonely months that I first felt the true weight of silence. There were no letters for weeks, and then months, and the gossip at the general store became our only source of news, always filled with names of the fallen and the missing. I learned to mask my terror with a face of stone, just as my mother had taught me. I became the daughter who worked until her fingernails bled, and who prayed until her knees were bruised, but the God I spoke to felt increasingly distant. I was no longer the girl who picked wildflowers by the creek. I was becoming a woman hardened by waiting and by the growing realization that the world did not care about our small dreams or our whispered promises. The innocence of my youth was stripped away layer by layer, leaving behind something colder and more desperate. I did not know then that the desperation would soon lead me to a crossroads where my conscience would be traded for survival, and where the girl I used to be would vanish forever in the shadows of the woods. By the winter of 1863, the world outside our valley had dissolved into a nightmare of smoke and steel. But for us, the war arrived in the form of a slow, agonizing starvation. The Confederate requisition officers had taken the best of our livestock, and what remained of our grain was stretched so thin it was more husk than flour. My father's strength was failing. The heavy stones he once moved with ease now seemed to mock his trembling hands. My mother was confined to her bed, her breath coming in shallow, ragged rasps that filled our small cabin with the sound of approaching death. It was in this desperate season that the shadow first touched our doorstep. One evening, as the light was failing, a man stumbled out of the woods. He was not a soldier in a clean uniform, but a hollow-eyed specter wrapped in rags of blue, his boots worn through to the skin. He was a deserter, a boy no older than Silas had been when he left, shivering with a fever that made his teeth chatter like dry bones. My father, governed by a lifetime of mountain hospitality and a quiet defiance of the war's politics, pulled him inside. We hid him in the root cellar, beneath the floorboards of the kitchen, feeding him scraps of hardtack and watered-down broth that we could ill afford to spare. For 2 weeks, I was the one who descended into that dark, earthen hole to tend to him. His name was Thomas, and in his delirium, he spoke of a mother in Ohio who was waiting for him to come home from a war he no longer believed in. I looked at his pale face and saw Silas. I saw every boy who had been sent into the mouth of the cannon, and I felt a dangerous, fierce protectiveness take root in my heart. But the valley was a place of long memories and sharp eyes. Word began to whisper among the few remaining neighbors that the Vances were harboring a blue belly, a traitor to the soil. The tension in our home became a physical weight, pressing down on my chest until I could hardly breathe. One night, a group of men from the village, fueled by home-distilled whiskey and the bitterness of their own losses, came to our door. They didn't come with lanterns and questions. They came with torches and the cold intent of men who needed someone to blame for their misery. My father stood at the threshold, his back straight despite his frailty, denying everything. I stood behind him in the shadows of the kitchen, my hand resting on the very floorboard that concealed Thomas. I could hear the boy's shallow breathing beneath my feet, and I knew that if they found him, they would hang my father from the oak tree in the yard. In that moment of pure, blinding terror, I realized that the truth would be our executioner. I looked at my father's tired face and my mother's sleeping form, and I knew I had to choose between a stranger's life and the survival of the only people I had left. The men were shouting now, their faces distorted by the orange glow of the fire. As they pushed past my father to search the house, I did something that would alter the course of my soul. I didn't cry out. I didn't plead. I waited until the chaos reached its peak, and then I led the way, not to the cellar, but to the barn, pointing toward the woods and spinning a lie so intricate and convincing that it drew the hunters away from our roof. But the lie was only the beginning. To truly save us, I knew the evidence had to vanish. That night, after the men had disappeared into the trees and my father had collapsed in exhaustion, I went back to the cellar. Thomas was awake, his eyes bright with fever and a terrifying gratitude. He reached for my hand, calling me an angel. I looked at him, and I didn't feel like an angel. I felt like a predator. I knew that as long as he remained, we were marked for death. I told him he had to leave, that the men were coming back, and that I would lead him to a safe path through the ridge. I helped him up the ladder, his weight leaning heavily against me, and we stepped out into the freezing bite of the December air. We walked toward the deep ravine at the edge of our property, the silence of the snow-covered woods wrapping around us like a shroud. My heart was a drum in my ears, and the air tasted of copper. I told myself I was protecting my family. I told myself that the war had already killed him, and I was just finishing the deed. The cold that night was a living thing, a biting spirit that seemed to turn the very blood in my veins to ice. Thomas leaned his weight against me, his breath hitching in his chest, a wet, rattling sound that filled the silence of the woods. I led him toward the Blackwood Ravine, a place where the earth simply falls away into a jagged throat of stone and rushing water. The path was slick with frozen mud and hidden roots, and every step felt like a betrayal of the earth itself. Thomas kept whispering his thanks, his voice a delirious murmur about how he would write to his mother and tell her about the angel in the mountains who saved him. Each word felt like a physical blow to my heart, but I did not stop, could not stop. I saw the faces of the men with the torches, and I saw the frailty of my father, and I convinced myself that this boy's life was the price of our sanctuary. When we reached the edge, where the ground gives way to the drop, I told him to sit and rest for a moment while I checked the trail ahead. He sank down, his back against a skeletal pine, his eyes closing in exhaustion. He trusted me completely. I looked at his sunken cheeks and his trembling hands, and for a heartbeat, the girl I used to be screamed inside me to stop. But the woman I was becoming, the one hardened by the bitter winter and the cruelty of the times, took hold of my senses. I didn't push him. I didn't have to. I simply reached down and took the heavy wool blanket I had wrapped around him, the only thing keeping the killing frost from his skin. I told him I was going to shake the snow from it. Instead, I stepped back into the shadows and watched. Without the warmth, the fever and the midnight air began their work with terrifying speed. He called out my name once, a confused, hollow sound that the wind carried away. I stood there, hidden by the trunk of a great oak, and I waited. I waited until his movements ceased, until the shivering stopped, and he became just another silent shape in the darkness. When I was sure the life had left him, I used a fallen branch to nudge his body toward the precipice. I watched as he slid into the dark, a quiet rustle of fabric against the frozen earth followed by a distant, muffled thud far below. The ravine would keep him until the spring thaws, and by then, he would be nothing more than another nameless casualty of a nameless war. I walked back to the cabin alone, the blanket draped over my arm like a shroud. I burned that blanket in the hearth before the sun came up, watching the fibers curl and blacken in the flames. When my father woke and asked about the boy, I told him Thomas had gained his strength and slipped away into the night to find his way north. My father nodded, a look of profound relief washing over his tired face, and he thanked God for the boy's safety. I stood there, the heat of the fire on my face and the cold of the grave in my soul, and I realized that I had saved my family by murdering my own spirit. The men with the torches never returned, and our secret remained buried under the snow. But from that night on, the silence in our house was no longer the silence of peace. It was the silence of a tomb. The war eventually ended, as all storms must, leaving the valley scarred and the silence of the mountains heavier than before. Silas never returned. A brief, impersonal letter from a field surgeon informed me that he had perished in a nameless thicket in Georgia. My father followed him a year later, his heart finally giving out under the strain of a world he no longer recognized. My mother passed in her sleep shortly after, her last words a blessing for the daughter she called her Grace. I was left alone in the cabin, the sole guardian of a name that remained untarnished in the eyes of the world. I eventually married a quiet widower from the next county, a man who valued my industry and my long periods of contemplative silence. We raised 4 children and saw a dozen grandchildren sprout like wildflowers in the meadow. To them, I was the matriarch of the ridge, a woman of unshakable faith and ancient wisdom. They looked at my wrinkled hands and saw only the years of baking bread and stitching quilts, never imagining the weight of the wool blanket I had once held in the winter dark. For 80 years, I have walked past the Blackwood Ravine. In the spring, when the laurel blooms, I stand at the edge and listen to the water rushing below. The world has changed beyond recognition. They speak of flying machines and voices carried through the air on invisible wires, but the earth beneath my feet remains the same. It is a patient witness. I have spent a lifetime trying to balance the scales, giving to the poor and nursing the sick, as if 1,000 acts of mercy could erase a single moment of calculated coldness. But the ghost of Thomas has never left me. He is there in the flicker of every candle and the chill of every first frost. I see his face in the eyes of every young man who passes my gate, a reminder of the life I stole to preserve a life that ended anyway. Now, the doctor says my own breath is growing thin, and the shadows in the corners of the room are beginning to stretch toward me. My children sit by my bed, whispering about what a peaceful passing I deserve after such a righteous life. I want to scream the truth at them, to tell them that their inheritance is built on the bones of a boy who only wanted to see his mother again. But even now, the habit of silence is a secondary skin. I am a woman born in 1844, raised to believe that a crack in the glass can never be mended, and so I have lived my life behind a polished, frozen surface. As I prepare to enter the final darkness, I do not ask for forgiveness, for I have never been able to forgive myself. I only hope that wherever Thomas is, the sun is warm on his face and there are no mountains to hide behind. I am Clara Elizabeth Vance, and I take my secret with me into the dirt, where all truths eventually rest.